All right. Hello, and welcome to Four Quick Cues, the live interview chat show where I ask pagan authors four questions determined by the roll of a dice. I am your host, Major Enfys Book of MajorArqueerna.com. Ooh, off to a good start already. Joining me today is Mhara Starling, author of Welsh Witchcraft, which I'm going to hold up and looks really cool with my green screen right now. Looks extra shiny and magical. Mhara was born in North Wales, raised on the Isle of Anglesey, and is a native Welsh speaker. She has been practicing witchcraft from a very young age. Mhara's work focuses on Welsh folk magic and witchcraft, a connection to the sacred landscapes and the spirits of the land. Mhara, welcome to Four Quick Cues.
Hi, lovely
Hi.
to be here.
It's very late your time, isn't it?
It is, it's wonderful. I'm up with the night owls and it's great.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being willing to chat at a very late hour for you.
Oh gosh,
So,
anytime.
yay! Excellent. So, have you ever been interviewed by a dice before?
No, special day.
It is a
Interviewed by a
special day.
dice.
Well, I find it helps if we can give the dice a name, so we have something to call it, and also to, say joyfully if it gives us a good question or angrily if it doesn't. I think all the questions are good questions, but whatever.
Mhm.
So what would you like to name the dice for today?
Ooh,
The
I
lovely red
think
one.
the lovely red dice. Well, I think I'm going to name it Gladys because it feels like a Gladys, and that's a Welsh name. So
Is it Galactus or Galapis?
Gladys. So like
Galapis.
glad,
Yep.
like the word glad,
Glap
but with an is at the end.
Glatis. Got it.
Yes.
Glatis. All right. So Glatis, give us our first question. Ooh, we got number 5. What drew you toward your subject matter, which is Welsh witchcraft?
Oh, well, that's quite an easy one. So, I obviously am from Wales originally. I grew up in a small rural part of Wales called Aberfraw, which is on the Isle of Anglesey and Ysmôn, which is the largest island around the Welsh coastline. Anglesey is a beautiful place. It's an absolutely stunning place. We get so much tourism every year because of our natural beauty. But another thing that's really interesting about Anglesey is that it has a lot of ancient historical monuments around, and it's also a place that is steeped in mythology and magic. So I kind of grew up in this landscape where we were immersed in nature, we were immersed in this magical landscape, and it was also a mythic landscape because when I always talk to people who are from other countries who maybe don't have as much mythology tied to the people that are the main people, inhabitants living there now, and often we talk about fairy tales and folklore as if they're these stories of like, oh, once upon a time in a land far, far away, a long, long time ago. Whereas where I grew up, it was very much like, so here are our stories. It happened over there. Just down the road over there. And that I was infatuated by that idea when I was younger, the idea of like how close we were to the stories and how they were an integral part of who we were as an identity. And they didn't feel like stories and fairy tales to me. They felt like part of history. It was like, oh, over here is where this witch landed on the shores and created a fountain out of nothing. Over down this way by the beach is where Branwen, the daughter of the sea god and also the sister of a giant, got married to the Irish king. And it's like, yep, that's just exactly what happened in our history. So as I grew up, I got more and more interested in magic. My grandmother was also really into like tea leaf reading and such. So I became infatuated not only with the landscape and the mythic landscape of where I was from, but also with the idea of magic in general. And I was quite the little outcast. I didn't really fit in with our community. So when I found a book in a charity shop called Spells for Teenage Witches, and there were spells in there for things like anti-bullying and how to make friends with magic and such, I jumped in on it and I never looked back really. Not long after that, I met some beautiful mentors who mentored me down the path of witchcraft. And eventually I met Christopher Hughes, who is probably my most influential mentor to date. He's also an author with Llewellyn, but he is the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order. And he introduced me to a stream of paganism that was inspired by the mythology, the history, and the folklore of Wales. So, though these stories that he was talking about to me were very familiar and were things that I grew up with, I suddenly clicked at that age. I think I was like 15 or 16 years old. I was like, oh, wait, these stories that I grew up with can play a role in my paganism. I don't have to look to far off cultures or countries. I can look right here on my doorstep. And that was transformative. So eventually, as I grew older, I became interested in folk magic and folklore, specifically folkloric witchcraft and how witchcraft played a role in our folklore. And I thought, there's a lot of people writing about druidry and about Celtic paganism, but there's not that many people writing about witchcraft and folk magic from a Welsh perspective. And so I was like, well, if they don't exist, maybe someone should start writing it. And after a lot of talks with people like Christopher, I was eventually told, nobody's going to write it. So you need to write it. You need to get out there and do it. And so I was inspired mostly by my land, my culture, my language. My first language is Welsh. And also by the people that I surrounded myself with as I entered into the realms of witchcraft and paganism. So yeah, I suppose that's what got me into all this.
It's such a beautiful story. I love that. And I love the empowerment of being able to, relate to the lands you're on and the history of those lands and the folklore of that specific small area and weave that into your magic. That just sounds so validating and empowering an experience. I love that.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, let's try for question number 2. All right. Sorry, tell me the name of the dice one more time. It just flew out of my brain.
Gladys.
Gladys. Got it.
Yes.
All right, we have 15 this time. So tell us something you learned in the course of writing your book, Welsh Witchcraft.
Ooh, something I learned. I think something that was very important that I learned, and I might get a bit preachy saying this now, but I learned that books are literally just a snapshot, a tiny snapshot of an author's life. And I never thought of it like that before I wrote a book myself. I remember I wrote the book Welsh Witchcraft in 2020. It took me about 3 or 4 months to write the book in its entirety. And it was just 3 or 4 months of compiling everything that I already knew about Welsh witchcraft into one book that could be easily read by anyone, no matter what level of witchcraft they'd come from. I knew that some people might pick up the book with no knowledge of witchcraft at all. And I tried to create this as beginner friendly as possible, but with enough information to also interest and intrigue people who might already know quite a bit about witchcraft as well. And it took me about 4 or 5 months to kind of compile all that information together. But of course, it was years and years worth of study and dedication. And then it took me until about the end of 2020 to submit it to Llywelyn. And then I didn't hear a response back because of the pandemic and such going on until about 3 or 4 months into 2021. And then, of course, there's the process, the publishing process in and of itself. And the book did not come out until early this year, so early 2022. So the publishing process in and of itself is a really long process. But the book itself is a snapshot into one tiny part of my life. And I started looking at books very differently then when I thought of it in that manner. When I think of it as this is such a small snapshot of an author's life and an author's expertise. And things can change drastically just within that period of the publishing process. I know I look back at my book now and there are sections that I am very proud of and I'm very excited about. But then there are also sections where I'm like, oh, I wouldn't write that right now in my life right now. If I were to write that today, I would not write it in the way that I did then. And it was only 2 years ago, but 2 years is a long time when you think about it, when you're studying and when you're learning. There are things in there that I don't fully agree with anymore. There are things in there that I now have a deeper understanding or a deeper knowledge of. And it really helped me look at books from a very different perspective, rather than judging a book, say, if it gets one thing wrong, or if something in there doesn't seem quite right, or if an author says something in 2015 that contradicts their book that came out in 2012. I learned to not take books as these be all and end all, because it gave me that perspective of, wow, this is just a tiny snapshot into an author's perspective. And I don't know, I don't know if maybe I'm just not that great at perspective and thinking of things, but it really blew my mind when I started thinking about that. I was like, oh, okay. And people keep telling me, oh, that just means that there's so much more you can write about in future books, and there's so much more that you can delve into as you go ahead as a writer and as you progress. And I'm thinking, yes, but Welsh witchcraft will always exist as that tiny snapshot of who I was in those couple of months in 2020. And I will forever look back at that book and think, oh, there are things in here that I don't quite gel with anymore, because we do change as people. It's part of our nature. We change and evolve and adapt, and things get more clear within our head, or maybe things change entirely how we believe. And I definitely do. Sometimes I'll go read a section of the book to try and find, maybe I'm like talking to a friend or something, and they're like, oh, what did you write about in this section? I'll go and thumb through it and I'll think, oh, I don't fully agree with that anymore. But that's just the way, the nature of writing, the nature of being an author, because you have to acknowledge that it is such a small snapshot into our lives, and that we can change and change our views entirely as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but that was definitely something that I learned from the writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I've been reflecting on myself as my book comes out this week. Is just, yeah, I mean, I also wrote it in 2020, and 2020, not only in my personal life, but in the globe, was a very unusual year. And it's been unusual years for many years now, but it's like, it's not only a glimpse into the author, it's also a glimpse into the time period in which things were
Yes.
writing, and like the broader cultural understanding of certain things, which evolves very quickly.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I feel similarly about, there's some stuff that I also was like realizing about books, that they're not worked on until they're perfect. They
Mhm.
are worked on until it is time to release them.
Yes.
And I think there's something both terrifying and freeing in that, and the whole "don't let the perfect be the enemy of the done" kind of thing. But also it's like, oh, okay, maybe there is a typo on this page, even after like 6 people read this really thoroughly many times. But yeah, no book is perfect, and they are just those little snapshots of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as a longtime book lover, it really is kind of profound to come to that
It is.
realization, because it's like, I got mad because this book wasn't perfect and everything I want it to be, and now I'm like, oh, it probably wasn't perfect to the author either. Like they probably weren't 100% happy with it. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's really
I think
interesting.
sometimes people forget that authors are just real people, that they just exist in the world, and that we're learning and growing just as anyone else is. And that maybe just because this one thing is in this book that doesn't align with what you believe to be true about that subject doesn't mean necessarily that the author still believes that, or that. And yeah, it was very much mind blowing.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see what we get next. Ooh, number 6. If you had a megaphone to broadcast a one-sentence message about Welsh witchcraft to the whole world, what would it be?
I think if I had a megaphone and I was going to broadcast a one sentence message, it would be: antiquity does not always equal authenticity. And that is something that I definitely try and push in a lot of my work right now, especially online and such. But I did write a little bit about in the book itself. And that is that, especially when you're coming from a topic such as Welsh witchcraft, which of course is tied into so many different topics such as Celtic paganism, Celtic polytheism, and you start digging into what do those things mean. A lot of practices that are formed surrounding, say, the Celtic nations and such, they're very much steeped in this idea of antiquity. People turn to Celtic paganism and Celtic polytheism because they feel a sense of something ancient, of something old. And I did too, I will admit, when I was a teenager and I first got into this, one of the draws for me was, oh, it's old, it's older than Christianity, it's something that I can really dig deep into, and it's ancient, and it connects me to something much bigger than myself and connects me to my ancestors. But something that I really try and tell people is that just because something is old or antiquated does not necessarily mean that it's more correct or more authentic. Just because something comes from hundreds and hundreds of years ago versus 20 years ago does not mean it's any better than the thing that comes from 20 years ago. And that was like a hard pill to swallow for some people that I talk to. It's always kind of like, a lot of pagans, I think, have this romanticization of the past and what it happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, which is really ironic considering that a lot of what we're told within witchcraft and paganism, modern witchcraft and paganism, a lot of what we're told is ancient, is rarely ever any more ancient than, say, Barbie or Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
So it's something that I think is important for all pagans and witches, or anyone who tries to follow a path which is inspired and informed by the past, because those words are what is important. We're inspired and informed by the past. We're not living in the past. We're living in the here and now, and it's really important to be rooted in the here and now. And it's something that going into a little tangent about something that was going on today, specifically on social media, which I don't know if I'll sound really preachy talking about this right now,
Go for it.
but today of all days, I put out a tweet saying, oh, I'm tired of a lot of, say, the diaspora over in America or Canada or Australia, people who have Welsh ancestry or Celtic ancestry in some form, whether it's Irish, Scottish, Cornish, whatever. I'm quite tired of people in the diaspora who have never set foot in these countries, never set foot in the land today, talking over people who live in these cultures to this day. And a lot of why people do that, why they talk over people who live in the cultures today, I think stems from the fact that a lot of people don't even realize we are a modern culture, a modern people who still exist. I think when people think of Celtic, they envision something fantastical, something in the past. They envision, women riding on massive shire horses with their long flowing curly red hair and their bows and arrows, chasing will-o'-the-wisps around standing stones. And they forget that no, Celtic is also, Joanne down the street who just bought a pack of cigarettes from the corner shop and is now going home to talk Welsh with her nine. It's like it's still Celtic, and we're not some distant past thing. And the culture of the Celtic nations changed, evolved, adapted, and syncretized with different things along the way. So it's not even a term that is strictly restricted to paganism either. We have Celtic Christianity, we have so much. And a lot of why people tend to talk over people who live in the Celtic nations today when it comes to the diaspora is because of that. But I got a lot of people who misunderstood why I put that tweet out there and were trying to say that I was saying that you shouldn't be proud of your ancestry or shouldn't have any interest in delving into that. And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, be proud of maybe wanting to delve into the history, the law, the culture of these nations that your ancestors derive from, or even if you have no ancestry, if you're just curious and you're just wanting to dig into it, that's perfectly fine too. And if anything, it helps preserve a lot of our culture, which is definitely needed, considering a lot of our languages have dealt with so much in the past and dealt with people trying to eradicate our cultures and such. So keep that culture alive by all means. But also remember that Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, they're modern places that exist today as well, that have their own politics, that have their own things going on. And we're not just a pagan nation steeped in the past that is long forgotten, that is being brought back into the here and now. We've always been here, and that is something that I think a lot of people need to hear, is that we never went anywhere. We're still here. In Welsh, we have a song that goes Rhyni yma o hyd, which translates to mean we're still here. And the lyrics of that song talks about how despite all the efforts to stamp us out, we persevered and we're still here. And it's something that I always look back and go, hey, that's a similarity between witchcraft, the Welsh, and also the queer community. We're still here, regardless of how many times people have tried to stamp us out. And it's how my three kind of core identity things coalesce together, because whether I'm looking at it from the perspective of being a witch, being Welsh, or being queer, that song, Rhyni yma o hyd, we're still here despite everything that's happened, is really inspiring and empowering. But anyway, back to what I was saying. I went on a bit of a tangent there. The be all and end all of what I would love people to learn is that though it is beautiful to be inspired and informed by the past and to have this romantic association of what the past is, it's important to also be rooted in the here and now, to be rooted in where we are now. There's no point trying to recreate or I guess repurpose the practices and traditions of our ancestors to work exactly as they did back then, because they won't, because we're not living back then. We're living now, here and now. And that's what the point of my book was, not to give people some ancient, antiquated view into some unbroken lineage of witchcraft, which goes back to Wales, but instead to give them a little information, a little bit of education into what the history of magic and mythology and witchcraft and folklore is in Wales, and how that can play a role in a wholly modern practice, a practice that is rooted here and now, and how it can work and benefit us today. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And one of the things I really appreciated about your book was that trying to take inspiration from the past, but make it make sense in a modern context, which is, I think, a challenge for a lot of people who practice witchcraft. There's this, like you said, this idealization, like the past was perfect and then everything went wrong. And that's not usually the case. You know, at times that were idealized for some were also very bad times for other people, like queer people in the 1950s, for example. You know, my parents think that was America's peak, but not necessarily for everybody, you know, like, so I love that. I also really appreciated how you talk about the importance of Christianity in the folklore, and because it is part of Wales's past, and you can't completely tease out because so much of it is oral tradition. I know that's one of the big challenges with being working with Celtic folklore and witchcraft and everything, is that endless game of telephone the stories have played over the centuries, and being transcribed by people who are coming at it from a different perspective than when it came. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but I really appreciated all those nuances in the book, and I found it really refreshing. So, all right. Gladys, let us do one more. For people watching on Facebook, feel free, if you've got questions for Mhara, type them in the comments. I'm going to go and check those in just a moment. But our last of the 4 questions is lucky number 3, which is rave about someone else's book. What is something great you've read recently?
Ooh. Oh, I've recently finished reading The Witch's Sabbath by Keldon,
Yes.
and I absolutely loved it. It's such a transcendental book. I just love that it takes a topic that is so well beloved in the witching community as a whole. Everybody loves the idea of the witch's Sabbath, the idea of spirit flight and such. And Keldon beautifully makes it so accessible to understand this concept by delving deep into the lore and the traditions and the customs of the witch's Sabbath and where these ideas come from and the way in which he navigates the history. It's just, sometimes when you read a book which focuses intently on history, it can get a bit stuffy and it can get a bit too much. And Keldon just does not do that. He does not make you feel like it's a burden to read it. He's just got such a wonderful writing style. And in this book, it's not just the history and the lore of the witches' Sabbath, but there's also practices in there that you can incorporate into the modern day witches' practice. So going off of what we were just saying, making these things that are so integral to the folklore and the history of witchcraft, making them work for the here and now, the practices that we have now. And I absolutely loved it. And I think I'm going to either reread it or listen to the audiobook version again, because I just adored it. So that's definitely something. And Keldon's work is just absolutely brilliant anyway. So overall, if you haven't read The Witch's Sabbath, but also The Crooked Path, which was another book by Keldon, absolutely phenomenal work. And they're also just wonderful people. They are a wonderful person, and I cannot get over how kind and generous and beautiful they are.
Yes, I got to meet Keldon at Paganicon a couple of months ago and take that workshop on the Witch's Sabbath. And now I'm really excited to read the book. I think it's going to be really good. Well, we've completed our 4-question gauntlet. At this time, I'm going to see if there are questions in the chat. I'm also going to include in the comments places where you can follow Mhara online, places where you can buy Welsh Witchcraft. While I do that, Mhara, if you would love to tell people more about the book, or if you have any upcoming projects you'd like folks to know about, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. So, Welsh Witchcraft, A Guide to the Spirits, Lore and Magic of Wales, is my love letter to Wales. And I absolutely love the fact that it's had such a warm reception. So many people have sent me such kind messages saying that it's inspired them to dig deeper into their ancestry or their culture, or even just into Wales in general. And the entire point of the book, in my little selfish opinion, was to try and put Wales on the map a little bit, to try and make these bits of information more accessible. So if you are interested in reading about the magic, the lore, and the spirits of Wales, as has it, then I very much would love it if you were to honour me by buying the book, because it is very much a love letter to the land of which I stem from. I also currently am working on the Welsh Witch podcast, which I've just released. So if you're more of an auditory listener, if you're someone who loves to listen rather than to sit and read, my podcast, the Welsh Witch podcast, just debuted 2 months ago. There's 2 episodes out so far. I release an episode each month. Some of them are interviews with amazing people such as Christopher Hughes, CCJ Ellis, who is an artist and author from North Wales as well, who they make these beautiful illustrations of Welsh magical creatures, and they have a book coming out as well called Welsh Monsters and Mythical Beasts. I also have interviews with people such as Sianister Powell, who is a museum professional and also a Celtic Studies person who absolutely has phenomenal interest in mythology and such. And also Dr. Gwilym Morris is going to be coming onto the show to talk about all sorts of things, mythology as well soon. So the podcast is something I'm really excited about. And there's also going to be episodes on folklore and witchcraft and magic all through the next year or so, once a month. So if podcasts are up your street, then do look me up, the Welsh Witch podcast as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have a question from the audience,
Ooh,
which I
no.
love. Ben Stimpson asked, when you were first starting out as a young Welsh person, is there a part of your book that you wish you had read back then?
Honestly, and I hope this is not blowing too much smoke up my own bum, but honestly, the whole thing, because I grew up being very much, I felt like I was on the outside looking in a lot of the time with the place that I grew up. I always romanticized the place that I was raised in. Aberfraw was a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere, and it's beautiful, absolutely stunning. But my childhood and my teen years were absolute terror growing up in Wales, and I did not feel like I belonged. And that is the danger of being openly queer in a rural environment. And specifically, I didn't feel like I fit into Welsh culture. So I remember being 12 or 13 and being like, I can't wait until I'm older so I can move away to some big city in England and escape these small-minded, village folk and their homophobia and transphobia. And I just did not feel like I connected with the culture, because the culture of Wales in my eyes back then was very much rooted in sports, so football or rugby. Every time I say football, people always go, oh, but isn't rugby the Welsh sport? And it's like, it is, but in my area it was football. Football was the sport people played the most. So unless you were into football or rugby, or if you were into farming of all things, you just did not fit quite. And so I never felt like I belonged. And then when I met people like Christopher and other mentors, such as I had a lovely mentor called Julie, who was a wonderful soul. She passed away recently, and I try to honor her as much as I can by mentioning her name in these kinds of things that I do. When I met people like them and I saw how they lived their life so freely, especially Christopher, because he was openly queer as well. And he was the first kind of queer man that I met that was so open about his life and was happy and was successful. And I'd been taught, being queer means that you will live a life of being unsuccessful for the rest of your life. So seeing Christopher was like transformative. It was like, oh my God, I have a chance to make a life for myself. And I don't have to leave Wales for it, because look at Christopher. And then finding these aspects of our culture, the magical aspects of our culture, which meant that there was another side to being Welsh that I wasn't really told much about. Even though we were taught about the myths and such, they weren't ever highlighted as being main elements of our culture. And on top of that, there are elements of the folkloric traditions and the magical traditions of Wales that I was never taught when I was young. So there are magical practitioners who were very flamboyant characters in their own rights. And when I read about them, the local wizards and the wise women who used to like dress in full velvet cloaks and walk down the village giving people cures and such, I was like, oh, it's me. Hello. I can see myself in these people. And I never saw that when I was younger. So I think if I would have found a book like mine, and once again, I hope this is not blowing smoke at my own bum, if I would have found a book like mine in a shop in Wales when I was 12, 13, or even going off all the way up to 16, I would have probably devoured it. And that's why I wrote it in the first place, was because I hope that I can be that voice to somebody else who might be struggling in the same way I was back then. So yeah, that was, I hope that answers the question.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I actually kind of,
I love.
oh,
That
one
was,
moment, I
I
have an
hope that
echo
answers the question.
happening here.
Oh dear.
Have to close some windows. Sorry about that. Um, anyway, thank you so much. This is great. And I was just going to say, I feel very similarly about growing up in Minnesota, where, as far as I knew, it was like if you weren't into football, baseball, whatever, it was hard to fit in. And I found out after I left that there's a huge pagan community there that I was completely unaware of when I lived there for 25 years. So it's like, wait, what? There could have been, my life could have been so different. I wish I could have found those people, but better late than never, I suppose. And I had such a lovely time at Paganicon, and still sort of baffled that this is where I grew up and all these amazing people are here. And I'm like, where were you? So yeah, that's really cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Mara. I really appreciate it, especially considering the hour for you. I also want to give a shout out to the upcoming episodes of the show. So coming up on June, oh goodness, did I accidentally delete what I needed here? Here we go. On June 29th, we have Jane Meredith, who's just written a wonderful book called Falling Through the Tree of Life, Embodied Kabbalah, which I had the pleasure of reading. It's really fantastic. Highly recommend it. July 6th will be Amy Blackthorne, who has written a book on protection magic that just came out. And July 27th, we will have Victoria Ratchkey, who does the Witchlit podcast, but also has written a number of fiction series about magic. And I'm really excited to talk to her as well. Mara, any final thoughts for the audience or for Gladys before we say goodbye?
Oh, no, not at all. Just thank you so much for having me. And I'm very thankful that you chose a dragon red dice as well. And thank you, Gladys, for choosing questions that I could actually answer.
It was definitely, I was thinking, okay, what would be the best dice for a Welsh person here? And I immediately thought, well, the dragon is red, so we'll go with the red one. I try to use a different dice every week, so that's great. Well, thank you so much, everyone who is watching and who had comments. We had some lovely comments in the chat throughout as well. Thank you so much. And this will be posted to YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you for taking the time. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day whenever you're watching this.